of their reading material, including fiction. So there you go. Let me learn how to push my slides forward here. There we go. Maybe a typical family scene with a group gathered around as one of them reads from the newspaper, perhaps a story. Sorry about that. At the same time, because of the size of the archive, which was hundreds of thousands of editions of hundreds of newspapers, and the lack of any index to them, very little has been known for sure about what fiction was published, where it came from, and who wrote it. So the National Library of Australia's digitisation of historical newspapers in Trove changed that situation. It's got over 25 million pages, and it's the largest open access collection of digitised historical newspapers in the world. So the British newspaper archive is larger, but it's not open access in the way that Trove is, so it doesn't allow data mining. This digitised collection made it possible to explore the fiction published in Australian newspapers for the first time in an extensive and systematic way. And so that's where I began noticing this digitisation and thinking, wow, that's a great opportunity. So the first part of my paper today, I'm going to discuss what I first saw this project to be, which is to identify and investigate fiction by Australian and international authors using a mass digitised collection of newspapers and with digital methods of analysis. But the project's also changed a great deal over the last decade, from one focused entirely on literary history to one concerned with building and maintaining digital infrastructure, and more recently to a project dedicated to public literary studies through crowdsourcing and collaborative editing and publishing. And each of these periods brings with it its particular considerations and requirements, but they're united by the idea of literary history as a material practice of engagement, with the documentary record, with its history of transmission, with the digital systems of contemporary knowledge production, and with collaborators within and beyond the university. So speaking of collaborators and collaboration, before diving in to discuss the project, let me note that for most of the time I've been running it, when I've been fortunate enough to have the funding, I've been joined by Carol Hetherington as the bibliographer on the project. In the early stages, it was also very ably supported by the developer Junran Lee from the Centre for Digital Humanities Research at the Australian National University. And since 2019, it's involved a range of other collaborators from the National Library of Australia, especially the Assistant Director General of the library, and other literary colleagues, so Dr. Roger Osborne from James Cook. Due to some recent funding that we received, it's now also involving Galen Cuthbertson, who's my PhD student, but also is working as a developer on the project. And without all of these people, you know, what you see today wouldn't be possible. Okay, so let me begin with the process of finding fiction in these newspapers. With digital humanities projects, when you talk about them, people often expect you to launch into some complex machine learning algorithm. But in fact, I used what is the most familiar part of our digital infrastructure in the humanities, which is the search box. But I used it in a different way to how we typically approach keyword searching in the humanities. This is what I didn't do. So I didn't put in the authors or the titles of fiction. And you might already be able to think of what would be some problems with that approach, but I'll just elaborate on that. So searching for titles of fiction or authors would have left me, first of all, with a lot of irrelevant results to exclude. So this is the results, the first page of searching for Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who's a really famous British writer of sensation fiction. And you can see there's lots of obituaries in there. I would have then had to do the same process for a long list of authors or a long list of titles. And more than simply being time consuming, this approach would have been largely self-perpetuating. So I would have only found the authors and the titles I expected to find. And perhaps more significantly for this particular project, this approach would also be, would also neglect the widespread anonymous and pseudonymous publication of fiction. So even by authors as famous as Braddon, they were often published anonymously, as well as the common changes in titles between reprinting of the same story. And I'll talk a bit about that later. Instead of searching for titles or authors, I developed what I call a paratextual method, which takes advantage of the consistency of paratexts in newspaper articles, designed so that readers can open the newspaper and see immediately which is the feature article, the crime reporting, the letters, the sports results, and of course the fiction. So one expression of this paratextual consistency is in the words used to introduce fiction, such as serial, story, author. Here you can see tales and sketches, novelist, and the most successful one definitely was right at the bottom right, chapter. These were the words I searched for. And so this paratextual method harnesses this particular technology of the newspaper designed to direct human searching and reading for digital discovery. And when the results I discussed today were finalised, which was about 2017, this paratextual method yielded a harvest of around 200,000 text files or articles. But the format of that data was not especially useful for literary history. So here's an example of a record. You can see, for instance, there's a lot of information in this first heading field, including the title, Wynnum White's Wickedness, some information about copyright, the nature of that copyright, and a chapter number and a chapter title. Other headings might only have chapter 8 in them, or some might have a lot more detail than this, including where else the title has been published, the other titles by the same author, information about genre or signature details, and so on. And there were also inevitably some results that came through that weren't fiction. So there was a lot of work that needed to be undertaken to transform what was extracted from Trove into data useful for literary history. And Carol and I worked on this task, and one of the main things we did was stitching the different installments together. So you can see here that this is chapter 8. That means there's probably 7 previous files that are of the same title in this newspaper. And some of these publications had 70, 80, 100, 150 different installments. So there was a lot of work to draw them together. And then Carol also did a lot of bibliographical research to find out who were the authors of these titles when they were published anonymously, and also to track down information about where these authors came from. So after all this data was cleaned up and organised and put into proper bibliographical order, we ended up with a bit over 16,500 publications for the 19th century. And in what follows today, I'm going to present some literary historical findings just on these 9,200 or so titles I call extended fiction here. And that means they were either serialized across multiple newspaper issues, or in around 2% of cases, they were published in a single issue of a newspaper, but they had more than 10,000 words in that single issue. Sometimes they had, 65, 75,000 words in a single issue of a newspaper. And the reason I focused on this extended fiction is because it suggests to me a particular form of publication, circulation, and reception. So short stories might be chosen simply to fill in a requisite column inch, but extended fiction was deliberately sourced and required some more commitment from the readers to follow the story over multiple weeks, or even if it was in the same edition, over multiple columns of newspaper print. So to give a bit of context, in total, prior to this project, the number of 19th century Australian novels that were known about across all forms of publication was around 800 titles. So in this data set, there are an additional 950 novels, only 150 of which are common to both records. So the project essentially doubles the number of Australian novels that we know about for the 19th century. And that includes new titles by well-known authors, as well as lots of titles by entirely previously unknown Australian writers. And I'm sure this effect would actually be the same and perhaps even more pronounced if I ever get time to have a look at the short fiction, which I haven't yet. So in this category of extended fiction, there are lots of authors who are popular and well-known, like Mary Elizabeth Braddon, some that are popular and completely unknown today. And there's also canonical authors. So it's not what you'd expect to do today, right, is open your paper and find Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, or Emile Zola's Angeline, but these were the type of stories that were published alongside the popular fiction in the 19th century Australian newspapers. And just, as a acknowledgement, just to say that this is a large collection of fiction is not to say it's complete. So at the time that these records that I'm going to discuss were harvested, which was 2017, when I compared the digitized records of newspapers to indexes of newspapers created for advertisers, around 30% of the 19th century newspapers had been digitized. It was more likely for metropolitan newspapers to be digitized than the provincial ones. And there's also some types of fiction, particularly fiction in non-English language newspapers in the Australian colonies that have not been identified by this method. Okay, so bearing these qualifications in mind, let's now turn to this expanded record of fiction and see what it can help us learn about literary and publishing history. And it might be useful briefly for me to tell you a little bit about what was thought about this publishing context before this project. So 3 things. The first was that it was believed that most of the fiction in the newspapers was by British authors. One estimate was over 80%. It was believed that this fiction circulated almost entirely in metropolitan newspapers, so that's the city newspapers. It was assumed there was very little fiction in the provincial newspapers, so those outside of the major cities. And finally, it's been widely argued that colonial readers in Australia were not interested in local fiction. So it's been said, for instance, that the emergence of an Australian literary tradition was chronically belated due to the lack of a market for local writing. So, in fact, the fiction identified in the newspapers challenges all of these prior understandings of this publishing and reception context. So a substantial amount of the fiction was British, and here you see an illustration from one of the canonical titles of 19th century fiction serialisation, which is Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, and that appeared in a Sydney newspaper 2 years after its initial London publication. But British fiction did not dominate to the extent that we'd expected. Of the titles where we were able to identify the author, and that's around 65% of the extended fiction, so there's still a lot where we don't know the author. Approximately half were British, but around a quarter were Australian and a fifth were American, and then the remaining 5% were made up of stories from a range of other countries. So these findings suggest substantially more Australian fiction than had been assumed, and generally a literary culture that was cosmopolitan rather than focused on British fiction. Where metropolitan newspapers have been assumed as the primary or even exclusive arena for publishing fiction, in fact, the majority of publications appeared in the provincial newspapers. And these are the hundreds of bi- or tri-weekly newspapers that serve the small towns in Australia. And this finding is made more remarkable by the issue I mentioned earlier, which is that metropolitan newspapers are more likely to be digitised. So in all likelihood, there's a lot more provincial publication that this result isn't showing. So provincial newspapers not only published more fiction than their metropolitan counterparts, they did so in highly organised ways. So in the metropolitan context, it's not unusual to find 2 or sometimes 3 newspapers publishing the same story around the same time. And if we trace the histories of those publications back, we can often find they were syndicated by a British or an American agency. So the syndicates were these companies that purchased stories from authors and sold them onto newspapers. In contrast to these occasional metropolitan groupings, when we consider titles published in the provincial press, there are these substantial groups of newspapers publishing the same titles around the same time. What we're looking at here are just little excerpts of network graphs where the thickness of the line indicates the number of titles that the 2 newspapers published in common, based on those we've discovered, and the closeness of the newspapers to each other indicates how many of the same relationships they shared with other newspapers in the network. So using these patterns as a starting point, we identified 11 separate newspaper syndicates operating in the provincial press in the latter half of the 19th century. and only one of them had been known about previously, and the extent of its operations weren't known. So these syndicates operated across multiple colonies and could include 70 or more titles and 40 or more individual newspapers, and again, probably a lot more given the proportion digitized. So even with the records we do have, the circulation figures show that stories published by these provincial syndicates would have reached as large, if not a considerably larger audience than the metropolitan publications. So some of these provincial syndicates published overseas titles, but the majority published Australian fiction at a scale that makes them, even individually, the most significant publishers of Australian fiction in the 19th century and up into the end of the 20th century, so around the 1970s. So these patterns of publications suggest reading communities that are markedly different to the ones literary historians have previously imagined. So this is how Australian literary scholars have thought about reading, which was that literary culture was produced in the metropolitan centres of the different colonies and then distributed, if it was, out to the individual provinces. So these metropolitan centres were understood to operate as separate nations, if you like, with each of the Australasian capital cities the centre of its own world, including its own print culture. The idea that fiction was always in metropolitan newspapers would have supported this narrative, but in fact, the provincial syndicates indicate that the Australian provinces had their own largely separate literary culture and that operated across colonial boundaries, so that people in the different colonies were reading the same stories as those in the other provinces, and including in Tasmania and also New Zealand, as we've looked at with looking at New Zealand's digitised newspapers, Papers Past. So while the provincial circulation changes the contours of colonial literary culture, the paratext of these stories offers a more specific challenge to the third key argument I mentioned, which is that Australians had no interest in local writing. And you might ask me, what do paratexts have to do with reception? Well, I'll put to you that it's a key aim of newspaper editors to sell newspapers. So it makes sense for them first to know what their readers were interested in reading, and second, to try and highlight, including in the paratexts, features they think their readers would look favourably upon. Now, if we just had one or two paratexts, we could just say that it might just be the idiosyncratic views of one particular editor. But if we look at thousands of paratexts, we can explore what newspaper editors, in general, thought would interest their readers. And one thing that's emphasised across multiple paratexts is the Australian origin of the fiction. So here's some examples. You've got an original Australian story, you've got a New South Wales MP or Member of Parliament, a failure in Melbourne and a new start in Sydney, so the chapter titles emphasising Australianness, pseudonyms like Old Boomerang. Here are some examples where the title and subtitles simply refer to Australia or places in Australia. And sometimes overseas stories were published to appear like local, and this often was quite blatant. So for instance, there was a story that was widely serialised in the provincial press, an American story called Floribel's Lover by Laura Jean Libby. Well, this is how it appeared in the Australian press, the rival bells of Parramatta, so Parramatta being one of the first settlements of the colonies west of Sydney. Old Sleuth's American detective in Russia was serialised as Barnes, the Australian detective. So although Australian fiction represents only a quarter of the known titles, Australian is the third most common word across the titles and subtitles of the 19th century extended fiction, coming after story and tale. So we can zoom out a bit to consider how the inscription of national or proto-national origins occurred more generally in the paratext and the prominent textual features like the chapter titles. This graph shows you the way in which nationality was represented or inscribed in the publication event for authors where we know their actual nationality. So this, for instance, here is on the left, is the way in which nationality was presented in stories that we know there are by American authors. And the bar shows that some of them were presented as coming from America, but also from Australia and Britain, from somewhere else, or from nowhere in particular. In all of these national categories, fiction was most likely to be presented as coming from the place where we know the authors came from. But American and other fiction was much more likely to be presented as coming from somewhere else or from nowhere in particular than were British or Australian writing, which were equally likely to be presented as coming from Britain or Australia, respectively. So rather than publishers disparaging Australian writing and thinking that they were only interested in the British, in fact, this suggests that both Australian and British fiction were perceived by editors and syndicators to be of interest to the readers. So to end my discussion of what we found with looking at what these findings can say about literary history, I'll just look briefly at the contents of these stories. And I'll just discuss a little bit about some of the Australian fiction. So I wanted to know, were national or proto-national tendencies evident within what was a transnational market in the Australian newspaper fiction? And one way to ask this question in computational terms is to explore if an algorithm can predict or learn to guess whether a story is, and I looked at American, Australian, and British as the largest categories. So I actually used a combination of two machine learning methods for this purpose. The first one's called topic modeling, and it's might be familiar to some of you. The modeler specifies the number of topics, so I said 100, and all of the words in the corpus are sorted into groups, 100 of them, called topics, depending on the likelihood of words co-occurring in multiple documents. So to give you an example, here are 3 of the 100 topics that were created. And you can see that a single word blood here can have different connotations depending on where it co-occurs. And that's one of the things that's quite interesting about topic modeling for literary purposes. So on the far left, blood is surrounded by words relating to king and courts. So it connotes lineage. In the middle, it's surrounded by words about men and battle. So it connotes bloodshed. And on the far right, you have it alongside terrible, blood-curdling nighttime horrors. So it's a sort of spooky feel. One problem with topic modeling is it can be difficult to move from the corpus topic view to think about the individual documents that we're used to engaging with as the units of literary history. So for this purpose, I used another method called decision trees, which are frequently used in disciplines like economics and ecology. And they're used to discern explanatory capacity and complex metadata. So I trained the data set which meant I gave it the data set a whole bunch of data where it knew all the topics and it knew what nationality these topics came from, like what documents it came from. And then I asked it to learn about the different degrees of topics in different documents and predict, based on just a few decisions, what nationality the stories were. So this is an example of the output of one of these decision trees. And this graph shows me that with 2 decisions, so I let the decision tree have 2 goes, about the presence of topics in the document, it can say to me that if the document has over this very small amount, 0.2% of topic 80, then it's Australian. And otherwise, it goes and looks at this topic 41 and says if it has over 2%, it's British, and about, oh no, yeah, over 2%, it's British, and under 2%, it's American. I had to do my crocodile. I don't know if you learned that at school, to do the greater and lesser. The crocodile eats the bigger one. Okay, so now it gets it right in about 60% of cases here, which is not super great. Like I wouldn't want to use it to do bibliographical designation of titles, so the expected accuracy would be 28% just randomly. So it's a lot better than that. And 60%, though not high, is not a problem for my purposes, because I'm not actually interested in categorizing the authors or finding the type of language that relates to all Australian or all American or British. Rather, I'm interested in whether there are any tendencies or inclinations in the literary language used by particular groups. So I'm using this modelling method not to define a statistical outcome, but to give me some sense of what I might be thinking of when I start reading. And this decision tree tells me, if we concentrate on topic 80, that this topic, if it's present even above very small amounts, is likely to indicate an Australian story. So looking at this topic, at first I thought, well, duh, creek, sheep, horse, gum, and so on. It seems obvious it's Australian. But, in a way, it's interesting because what we've been told in Australian literary history, at least in the 21st century, is this idea of what's called bush fiction was sort of a made-up projection of 20th century literary historians back onto the 19th century. So it wasn't really there. They were just looking for some sort of original local literary tradition, and they projected this idea of the bush back onto what was actually a cosmopolitan literary culture. So the fact that it suggests that this topic is actually helpfully predictive of Australian is interesting. But it gets more interesting when we start to look at what is contained within these bush fictions. So the bush tradition is supposed to be one of the solitary bushman getting away from domesticity, from women, from children, going into the bush, doing it alone, claiming the land, and having intense male friendships sometimes, so mateship. This was what it's supposed to be about. However, when we look at some of the keywords like veranda, buggy, homestead, station, we can see that these stories are likely to feature what are actually domestic bonds between men, women, and children. And that turned out to be the case when I was reading. So the illustration here is from one of the stories, the story of a royal pendulum, and it's indicative of this feature. You can see a man and a woman, they're in the bush, but they're facing this challenge of the bushfire together. But it's the other prominent keyword, black, blacks, tracks, mob, that indicate the most surprising characteristic of this fiction. So this finding goes against a really central argument in Australian literary history, which is that 19th century Australian fiction replicated the legal right of terra nullius, so no one's land, by not depicting Australia's First Nations people, so by not showing Aboriginal people. But in fact, pretty much a routine feature of these stories is to include Aboriginal characters. So you won't be surprised perhaps to know that a lot of these characters are really presented in very problematic ways. To give just a brief example, this is a passage that occurs after the manager of a station has been speared by a group of Aboriginal people, and the shepherd who's speaking says the Aboriginals are savages who would kill and eat their own children. So just terrible. But he's also describing his family as trespassing upon land governed by strict laws, and says that he would never have come if he knew that this was the situation. And there's similarly conflicted and complex examples of views of Aboriginal relations to land in these stories. So regardless of the attitudes to colonisation, the consistent depiction of Australia's Aboriginal inhabitants indicates that we need to reassess this idea of colonial fiction asserting terra nullius. So working out why literary historians have thought there were no Aboriginal characters in Australian fiction returns us to the publication, circulation and reception of this fiction, and particularly to the afterlife as books of only a very small proportion of the newspaper fiction that was published. It would seem that the local fiction that was selected for publication in books in Britain was that which didn't include Aboriginal characters. And it was these British published books that have come back to Australian libraries and have stood for us as our national literature, even after they've been selected through this colonial imperial lens. So the absence from our existing literary canon of Aboriginal characters would appear to be a consequence of decisions by book publishers in Britain, rather than a reflection of what colonial Australians were reading and writing in the 19th century. So if this was a traditional literary project, I'd have finished in mid-2018 when I published a book about this project, and it's available open access if any of you are interested in learning more about newspaper fiction. But digital projects don't end in the same way, because data brings new responsibilities. And it takes them, or it took me, to this second stage of the project, which is infrastructure building. With a traditional piece of literary research, I would have a reference list in the back, and I would list the titles I'd cited, and it would be up to the libraries and the museums, the galleries, and so on, to make sure that those sources continue to be available. But for this project, I can't just point to Trove and say, there, go at it, there's the evidence, because the transformations I brought on the evidence and the historical moment in which I interrogated Trove are constitutive of the arguments I've been able to offer. I'm also conscious that I've barely scratched the surface of the arguments that could be made. So as I said before, I've not even looked at the short fiction. Beyond its capacity to contribute to future book historical arguments, I feel I also have a responsibility to maintain these new cultural records. So as I said earlier, the newspaper fiction doubles the number of Australian novels that we know to exist, and the newspapers are the only site that those can be accessed. So I felt this responsibility to maintain that accessibility for a broader group of readers. To deal with these issues, I did what lots of people have done before me, and many have done since. I created a public website, and here's the landing page. It's still available. You can go and have a look around. It makes the full bibliographical and textual records of all the stories that we've found, rather than just the subset I've analysed available. So it allows anyone, researchers, members of the community, whatever, to search in a variety of ways. And you can see, you can look by author name, title, gender, nationality, newspaper. These are facets, dates as well, and you can do in-text searching. It also supports future computational work, should anyone want to do that, by making the full data set exportable, or also you can export the subsets that you've selected with the different facets. But we all know, or at least we all fear, what happens to a lot of these digital humanities websites. They're launched, time passes, they stop working, project funding runs out, patches and updates are not conducted, systems become obsolete, data is lost. And I'm under no illusions of my capacity to escape that cycle. So a public website is not really adequate infrastructure for literary studies, for digital humanities, for the humanities. Instead, to meet my responsibilities for data sustainability, I collaborated with the National Library of Australia to re-ingest the data generated from their digitised newspapers back into their records. So this involves a data mapping process so that the relevant fields in my database could be associated with relevant fields in their metadata schema. And the result is that all records in the to be continued database are now included alongside the other records in the National Library's catalogue. They've recently updated their interface, and I only have screenshots of their just recently closed one, but it's the same sort of principle. So this image shows a title in the newspaper as it appears alongside 3 book editions of the same story that are also indexed by Trove. This image shows a title where the only records known about, though by the same author, are in the Australian newspaper fiction database. And you can click on these harvested records and get a list of the contents. Remember, it was about grouping all these different instalments together. And you can also go back to the Australian newspaper fiction database and look around there. So this harvesting process ensures that all my database records will be available long after my website has ceased to exist. And to my knowledge, this is the first Digital Humanities project to complete what we're calling, so with my collaborators in the National Library, the 360-degree data model for cultural data. So both drawing on and feeding back into a national digital collection in ways that enrich knowledge and accessibility of the documentary record, while also ensuring the sustainability of future research findings. But making the records public did another thing, which was bringing me face to face with the problems with those records. And that realization began the third stage of this project, which was the public-facing one. So what are the problems with this data? Well, one of them will be obvious to anyone who's spent any time looking at digitized 19th century or earlier records, which is that the text is created by applying optical character recognition algorithms to the image you can see on the right to produce the text on the left. And these algorithms are amazing, but then also in a lot of ways not very good, particularly when, as you can see in this in the image, there's blurriness, there's a lack of clarity, there's not a lot of distinction to the letters. And you can see there on the left then what the result is, which is really terrible text. Another problem is the gaps in the fiction recorded. So compared to when I conducted my analysis of Trove in 2017, Trove today has around 8 million more digitised newspaper pages. So think of all the fiction that hasn't been identified by the project. So to deal with these issues, I decided to make what was previously a broadcast model of digital infrastructure, presenting the fiction discovered, into a collaborative crowdsourcing project. So the project allows anyone to sign up and become a member of the research community. And there's a number of things that can be done when you're part of the community. The first one, which most people do, is text correction. So using Trove's API to build on their text correction facilities, users can find a title they're interested in the database and go in and correct the errors in the OCR rendered text. Corrected text can be drawn back into the database, which improves the accuracy of keyword searching within Trove, but it also then improves the records in the database for reading or for subsequent computational analysis. A second job that members of the crowdsourcing community can do is add missing chapters or installments of fiction. So perhaps they're correcting a story, and as they go along, they realise, as you can see here, that chapter 6 is missing. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. And so that is a chapter that wasn't picked up in our automatic paratextual method. They can find that chapter in the newspaper, and they can just take the unique article ID, which is in the URL, put it in the database, and that will add that chapter to the database. A third job they can do is to create entirely new stories or records for stories they find. And this has been done by in three main types of ways so far. Fans of a particular author have often come and added all the fiction that they can find of that author. So that's been done, for instance, with Australian author Henry Lawson and with British author Agatha Christie. Local community or history enthusiasts who are interested in their local newspaper or in a particular type of newspaper, often a particular type of political newspaper, will go in and find all the stories in their local or the newspaper of interest. So that's happened, for instance, with the feminist publication The Dawn. And researchers, often honours or PhD students who are researching a type of fiction, can add stories that they come across that are relevant to their particular projects. So far we've had stories added about bushfires and also ghost stories. So those are two of the projects. And because Trove harvests from the database every week, all of the crowdsourcing additions are added to the National Library of Australia's record. Since its public launch, around 800 people have signed up and at different times corrected and added chapters and fiction, and around 2,000 new titles have been added by members of the public. and the text of many thousands more has been corrected. So in fact, we've just had some new funding, so we're starting to add texts discovered from the automatic method now, and we're now up from 21, which is the records that I've been discussing, up to I think 29,000, around that. So I get lots of emails from people telling me about their findings, alerting me to what they think is really good or really bad fiction, and generally sharing their interest in doing literary history. And it's from these email discussions that I got the idea for the final, currently ongoing stage of the crowdsourcing project. So one of the things that surprised me about this communication was that people were sort of wanting to liberate the fiction from the constraints of the database. So there's lots of ways in which the digitization process introduces restrictions that make it difficult to fully correct the fiction. That might be carriage lines or lines running together and so on. So members of the community have reported to me that they feel there's this lack of anywhere for them to also record their findings and their thoughts on the fiction. So they can email me, but they want to do something different. So to that end, in collaboration with the National Library of Australia, we're working on a publication platform, and this is just a mock-up, but the idea would be that members of the crowdsourcing community will be able to publish their own editions as ebooks from the newspaper fiction, and that will also be included in the newspaper catalogue. And that means, it might mean choosing a canonical work like we have here, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, or it might mean doing entirely different things like writing your own story using parts of the 19th century story, or editing a collection of stories on a particular topic. So maybe you really love kangaroos and you want to create your own edition. And these ebooks will then also be put in the National Library of Australia's records, so that your edition of, for instance, the Katherine Bode edition of Edwin Drood can appear in the National Catalogue alongside the Penguin and the Chapman and Hall, the Allen and Unwin editions. So if the original project used the paratext of fiction to explore the reading practices of Australians in the 19th century, the hope is that these editions might give some insight into practices and relations to literature in the contemporary era. So I'll leave you with this picture from one of the newspaper stories, which I think characterises how digital humanities is seen by some other humanities scholars, which is as a sort of snake in the grass, lying in wait, ready to pounce on and kill the humanities. And I hope I've made the case that digital approaches can instead make a contribution to questions that have long motivated humanities and literary scholarship, but that they can also be used to forge new connections beyond the academy, beyond publishers and academics and librarians, all the way to members of the public. So working in both of these directions holds, I think, the best hope for the future of literary history and literary studies in the universities, in research infrastructure, and in the public sphere. Okay, excellent. Well, that's my paper today, and I'm really interested to hear any questions.